Well, hello and welcome everybody. I hope you can see me. My name is Dr. Fritha Langford and I'm today going to hopefully answer some of your questions here on the Google Hangout. I have with me in the room Lorraine here, who is our Jean Marchig's Centre Administrator, and she's helping me out because I am here all on my own today. And we do have Jill Mackay lurking in the background, but online from somewhere else, so you may hear from her as well at some point. Now, I can't see me, so I hope you can see me because unfortunately my video seems to have gone, but never mind. What we'll do to start with is answer some of the questions that have been up in the discussion board over the week, and then if we get live questions in thereafter, then we can answer those as well. So let's make a start. Well, I'd like to thank everybody first of all for all the great questions that have been on the discussion boards so far. They've been really interesting. I particularly enjoyed the questions about cow and calf separation because that's something that I'm very interested in. And we've also had a lot of discussion about the basics, I suppose, on why are male laying hens killed, destroyed at birth, and why do we not eat them, and all of those sort of things. So those have been really, really very interesting from our point of view, and I hope you found them useful as well. Right then, without further ado, I'm going to start with some of these questions that have been on the link that we've had up for the week. If I just get the right bit right. So I apologise that the questions are on this screen over there, so I'm going to occasionally look over there to read them, but hopefully I'll remember to come back over here and answer the questions looking into the camera. But as I say, I can't see me, so hopefully you can. Right then. I'm just wondering if I can do anything about the camera thing here. It went off as soon as I pressed start, didn't it? But never mind. We'll just continue on either as a disembodied voice or hopefully you can see me too. My camera appears to be working, but as I say, I can't see it. Never mind. Well, the first question that somebody was asking, Suzanne was asking on the discussion board, was about cannibalism in poultry. So we looked in the laying hen video about feather pecking, which is very, very common, and cannibalism, which is less so, but still quite a common occurrence and a common cause of death in laying hens. Now Suzanne asks, given that cannibalism occurs in poultry, is there any evidence of prion disease occurring or possibly developing as a result? And the answer is, so far, no. Bearing in mind that most of the cannibalized birds are caught fairly quickly, so they're not eaten to a great extent, and also they tend to be eaten from the back end up rather than the top, so there wouldn't be very much central nervous system tissue digested by the birds that are doing the cannibalizing. That it's fairly unlikely. But it was a great question because it shows that we're thinking about links between the animals that are being eaten by us and the animals that are on the farm together and possibly eating other animals as well. So fantastic, but probably not. Also, because these are laying hens, we don't actually eat them, we only eat their eggs, so I don't know whether there's any evidence of prions being transferred to eggs. We had lots of questions about milking cows, looking into the video cameras when we went and did our videoing there, and both the cows and the pigs were very curious when we came round with our cameras, and dairy cows in general are very, very curious animals. They tend to spend a lot of time with humans. Obviously they're very well handled, they are handled on a daily basis. So they're not afraid of humans in the same way that maybe sheep would be when they're not used to human handling. So bringing along a tripod and a big camera and a couple of extra people meant that the cows were very curious about what was going on. If you watch the bits where we took videos in the parlour, you'll also know the cows were looking at us from when they were in the parlour and not walking out as what they were supposed to be doing. Yeah, absolutely, they very interested in novel things. Our pigs are also very interested in novel things as well, and were looking at the camera and interacting with us. And we tend to find that pigs that are very well handled and have a good stock person are more friendly and also less scared of novel objects such as video cameras than those that have a poor relationship with stock people. So that's those questions. Now then, where's the other one? Somebody asked a great question about pain. I'm just going to scroll to it, so hang on 1 second. Where is it now? Here we go. Pain identification and management. So the question was from Anonymous, and they asked about phantom pain. So they said humans with amputations are known to suffer phantom pain from the missing and amputated limb. Presumably they take pain meds or do some kind of mind exercise to deal with this. And he or she, Anonymous here, wondered if animals with docked tails and trimmed beaks, etc., feel phantom pain, and if so, how do we know? Well, that's a fantastic question, Anonymous, and the answer is we do have some evidence that animals that have some kind of amputation feel phantom pain. So this is generally formed in humans if neuromas, which are sort of nerve scar tissue, if they are formed when the limb is amputated. And we know that the hot blade method for laying hen beak trimming can form neuromas in the beak. The beak, of course, is a very, very sensitive area and is used by the hen to explore the environment as well as to eat food. And so it's very innervated. And removing that end of the beak means that it's possible to form neuromas. And say the hot blade method tends to do that more than the infrared method, which is one of the reasons why the infrared method is preferred in the EU. The neuromas are we think are the mechanism for the phantom pain that people feel when they have limbs amputated. This is also reported in the stump of pigs' tails as well after tail docking, so it's likely that pigs will also be able to feel phantom pain, or feel that they can still feel the end of the stump of their tail once it's removed. So ideally we would want to minimise these types of mutilations as much as possible. It's not always possible, as you know, so some mutilations such as ear tagging are very important for the identification of animals. But tail docking is only really done, tail docking in pigs that is only really done because of poor environments. If you increase the amount of enrichment that's in an environment and you have space for animals to move away from aggressive or bullying animals, then you don't, as a rule, need to dock tails. So ideally farmers would move away from very barren environments and use more enriched environments, and then they wouldn't need to dock the tails, and therefore reduce the factor of the phantom tail pain, as it were. It's a little bit more tricky with the beak trimming because that's something that's done a lot as, again, for feather pecking. Again, a very, very enriched environment can reduce feather pecking, but it doesn't get rid of it completely. We don't fully understand exactly why birds feather peck one another. And in all commercial environments, hens peck one another. So beak trimming is something that's done quite routinely, really. Ideally, again, we'd like to improve the environment so that hens no longer beak trim. I hope that helps. So yes, that was a really good question, and something that we have done a fair bit of research into as well. Now then, which was the next one we were going to look at?
It'd be good if we could get that camera.
I know.
I can't see the link.
Is it the link's not working? People are asking questions, but I can't see whether anybody can see the camera or not.
Isn't there normally the little icon of the camera somewhere?
It's here, but the camera is on. So hopefully you can see us, but
Yeah.
I really
Yeah,
don't.
I think we can see you, ladies, because I have just opened it up silently in another window, and I can indeed see you. So no worries.
Oh, and now we can see us too.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you've done, Jill, but
Thank you, Jill.
You may well have saved everybody, or they could see us all along. I have no idea.
I don't think I saved you. I think they could see you all along.
Excellent. Well, good job I was looking into the camera for most of it then. It's all good. I'm just trying to find the question that I was going to answer next.
Just let me know if I can scroll and find it.
That would be grand.
What were we looking at for this?
Oh, yes. So there was a question from Peter Sandball about broiler production, and particularly within the broiler production video. He asked about the broiler weight and the amount of weight gain that broilers make in the number of weeks, and the graph then that was looking at the weight gain for broiler breeders. So at one point in the video it stated that broilers reach a weight of 3,000 grams, 3 kilograms in 6 weeks, and he then points out we then see a graph for the development of breeders on ad lib and restricted feeding. And so we say that the weight is similar to in the breeders as it is to the main broiler chicken. But in the graph it says that the weight of 3,000 isn't reached until about 10 weeks of age, as opposed to 6 weeks in the broilers. Now the reason for this is that the broiler breeders that were used in the graph were where the parents were two different strains to make a hybrid strain that the broiler was, and the two different strains were slightly less fast growing, or the ones that we were looking at, either the males or the females, were slightly less fast growing. So they were very fast growing, but not quite as fast as the resulting broilers from that. And I hope that makes that clear, because it's a little bit confusing. But broilers themselves do reach 3,000 grams or 3 kilograms in 6 weeks of age, so they can actually be slaughtered at 35 days, and 42 days is the sort of average, but they can be slaughtered earlier than that, 35 days, which when you think from egg to table in 35 days is quite amazing, and something that doesn't really occur in any other animal. Right then, what I thought was maybe I could answer a couple of these questions that are coming in. So we have here a question about, I'm going to select it, hang on, there we go. So this one is from Jane, I think, and they say, good afternoon, I was surprised to learn that when breeding laying hens, all male chickens were gassed. It's obvious that they can't be used for egg production, but could they be raised for meat? Well, it's a great question, and it's one that has been discussed a little bit on the discussion boards, but we may as well bring it up again here, that laying hens are very, very heavily selected for egg production, and in doing so they have not been selected for producing any meat on their bodies. So they are quite skinny birds, really, and they don't have much, they don't carry much meat. That being said, of course, one could eat those male birds if you raised them, but if you think about the amount of feed that you'd have to give them to raise them to a state in which that they would be able to be slaughtered for the table, it would be a lot more than is the case with the broilers. The broiler chickens have been very, very heavily selected for fast growth and large amounts of meat production on their bodies, particularly in the breast area for chicken breasts. So those two different birds, they're completely different, have been bred for different things, and it is so cheap to produce broiler chickens that it's absolutely not worth anyone's while growing on those males. So that may feel wasteful, but there's no economic value in growing the males from the laying hens. They just wouldn't perform in the same way. They would take a lot longer. Their growth curve would take a lot longer to reach anywhere near the weight birds from the broiler side of things. So they are two completely different breeds of chicken. We've changed them from something that could be eaten and produce eggs to two separate types of bird, one which gets eaten and grows very, very fast, and one that produces eggs but it doesn't produce meat. So those chicks are gassed. Some of the chicks will be used to feed lizards and snakes and things, or go to zoos to feed the animals in zoos. But I mean, that's a tiny, tiny proportion. When you think that in the UK alone, there's around about 30 million male chicks a year that are gassed, that's a lot more than would need to fill the feeding bowls of the lizards and snakes and zoo animals in the UK. So you can see, and that's just the UK alone, you can see that it's such a huge industry that there's not much use, as it were, for those animals. And it does feel very wasteful. I say they are killed very quickly. So if we were looking on a quality of life scale, they don't have any quantity of life and a very, very short life, but that life is over and done with very quickly. And in terms of their use, in terms from an environmental point of view, they generally are rendered down for fertilizers and things like that. So yeah, they're not raised for meat, and it would be unlikely that anybody would do so because it's not economically viable. Thanks very much for the question. It's a good one.
Yeah, it was interesting. I didn't know a lot about that. I'm learning here too.
Let me go back to the boards. There was another good question that I want to get to. This one. Phil Robinson's. I'm going to try and find Phil Robinson's question, so hang on one second.
I could read it out for you, Fritha, if it's the one.
Is it there?
Yeah, it's. So Phil Robinson asks, production animals are bred for maximum meat, milk and egg production, often to the detriment of their overall fitness. Broiler chickens are a case in point. They are bred for such a rate of growth that after a couple of weeks they are too heavy to walk properly, and breeding stock have to be kept hungry so that they don't also become obese. How can breeders of farm animals be encouraged or made to change tack and select for fitter animals?
Absolutely. So there we go. We've got this situation where farm animals have been bred very, very intensively for whatever their production purpose is. So we have cows that have been bred very, very heavily for milk yield. We have broiler chickens that have been bred very, very heavily for meat production and very, very fast growth. And we have laying hens that have been bred very, very heavily for egg production. Absolutely right, and this means that some of their fitness traits are adversely affected directly because of the selective breeding for the production trait. So there's lots and lots of bits and pieces to do with farm animals that are more affected by the environment in which they're housed in, but the genetic selection for the farm animals can sometimes affect them no matter what environment they're in. So if we take the laying hen as a case in point, you can see that whether she is in the furnished cage, whether she's in the free-range systems or an aviary type of system, because she's been selected and selected and selected for egg production, her bones are very brittle. And that means in different environments she can have bone breakages. So Phil's question was, would it be possible to move away from that now? So we have these animals that have been selectively bred for whatever their production trait is, and we want to move. And he was asking whether farmers could be persuaded to move away from that. On the poultry side and a little bit on the pig side, I think it's worth mentioning that both pigs and poultry, the farmer doesn't have as much choice in what goes into the breed as compared to the individual farmer. The person who's working with the stock doesn't have very much choice as compared to the company which produces the animal. So with broiler chickens, for example, there are very few companies in the world that actually produce all of our farm animals, or all of our broiler chickens. So it's the breeding companies that do the selective breeding. It's the breeding companies that select these animals for these extreme traits. It's not the farmer themselves. So it's not the individual farmer that can make that decision. They don't have anything to do with the breeding. They just get the chicks at day old. And to a certain extent, that's the same for laying hens, and also in most cases for pigs as well. So the farmers that are producing the pigs that we eat do breed them from their own sows, but those sows are brought from breeding companies, and the semen that is used for artificial insemination is also brought from breeding companies, and they have less of a choice of how that is altered. So from some respects, it's the breeding companies that need to put in the changes in breeding. Dairy cows are a little bit different, and we'll come to that in a minute, because farmers have a little bit more choice over how they breed their dairy cows than do the farmers of the pigs and poultry.
Fritha, would this be a good opportunity to mention code EFABAR, which is the Commitment to Responsible Breeding, which was recently, I think it's an EU launched code, and the idea is that it's a voluntary code of good practice in support of responsible farm animal breeding, and organisations sign up to this voluntary code, which means that they do have to include welfare and health indicators in their breeding programs, which is relatively recent. I think it was only early this year.
That's right.
Yeah.
But what you'll find is that actually the huge breeding companies such as Jeanne, such as Jeanne, all these big breeding companies which are worldwide based, they are already doing it.
Absolutely.
So they're already adding in health and welfare traits. So the code to do that has been brought in after the companies are already doing this. So yes, it's a good code. Yes, it's another good thing to say. Here's something that we're doing that's positive for animals, but it is already, as it were, after the big companies have already started putting this into practice. So if we look at broiler chickens, the chickens that we eat for meat, they have improved hugely in the last 10 years in terms of leg health. So 10 years ago, you would find that mortality rates and morbidity rates were much higher for leg health than they are now, because animals were getting to the point where they weren't being able to walk in the sheds, and farmers were having to cull them there and then a lot more frequently than they do now. So by adding in leg health traits into the breeding indices for broilers, they've managed to turn that around very, very quickly. And of course they have, because the generation rates for broiler chickens are fairly low. We go from the adults to the breeding to the young, and then the next generation very quickly. So you can introduce traits extremely quickly there. With pigs, it takes a little bit longer, because, of course, the breeding traits are a little bit slower than with chickens. But again, there are some moves to introduce health and welfare traits in pigs, less so than in broiler chickens, interestingly. So as I said, with cows, the farmer has more choice, because they can choose the semen that they want to use for artificial insemination for each individual cow that they have on the farm, and they might choose a selection of different bulls based on their traits, and they have a lot more information, I think, available for what traits they want to be able to use on their herd. And it was actually farmers themselves that started to complain to the breeding companies in the UK, particularly, to say these cows are no longer living very long, where I'm having to cull these cows, my cows on my farm, after 2 lactations, or after she's just about got to her 3rd lactation, and this isn't how we used to live, this isn't how it used to be, and is there anything we can do about this? So it was interesting that actually came from farmers, as well as there was some public pressure and obviously scientific evidence to suggest that cows were very lame, had a high proportion of lameness, of mastitis, and other health problems as well. So the breeding indices of dairy cattle have also now included mobility traits and also longevity as well. So again, lameness is no longer getting any worse in the UK. So what was previously happening was lameness that was getting worse year on year, and longevity was getting shorter year on year. Well, that's stopped, and there's some evidence to suggest it's now getting better. Not the be all and end all, of course, because you can improve your animals, but if you're still keeping them in conditions which are going to make them lame, then that's also a problem. They're not necessarily going to get much better, they're just going to stop getting worse, if that makes sense. We've done a lot of science in this area as well. So one of the projects that SRUC have been involved in was one called Genome, which was looking at the relationship between pig genetics, so selection for different traits, and piglet survival. And it was looking at in different environments as well, indoor and outdoor environments. And it was looking specifically at piglet survival instead of the numbers born. Because the problem was that the farmers and the breeding companies were going up and up and up with the numbers born of piglets, but they weren't necessarily surviving until weaning. So you had this selection for more and more piglets to be born, but it was very hard for the farmers to be able to get, say, 16 or 18 piglets that come from one sow to weaning. Partly because they would have to be cross-fostered because she wouldn't have enough teats, and also because they wouldn't be very thrifty piglets. They would be very different sizes. So some would be very big and some would be very small, and some of them would be better at surviving than others. So this project was looking at a way of trying to promote piglet survival, so the number of piglets that reach weaning as opposed to the number of piglets that are born, as a way of introducing much more health and welfare traits into the pig environment. And that's been pretty successful. And that's really demonstrating that it requires the scientific integrity on those aspects of looking at piglet survival, and also the interrelationship between selection. And brings about how important it is to have a scientific basis, an evidence basis, to be able to go to breeding companies and saying, well, this is how you should do it. This actually makes more money for you, and improves welfare. So it's a win-win situation, which is something we're always looking at. I'm wondering if I can answer a couple of questions on the Google Hangouts here now. Goodness. Well, there's a question here, and I'm going to try and answer it fairly briefly, by Jude Aitken on sheep. So they say that even though there weren't any sessions on sheep, they'd be grateful if you could discuss any recent work on how to improve the welfare of farm sheep. Well, SRUC does an awful lot of work on welfare of sheep, and our colleagues elsewhere around Europe and the world as well. We have a couple of very big projects at the moment going, one of which is called Mothers Matter, and that is looking directly at improving the welfare of mothers while they are pregnant, so that we can understand how that improves the welfare of young animals, and then as they go on to be the productive animals that we eat or use in other ways. Yes, that's one of the big projects we have. We have another big project is called the Animal Welfare Indicators Project, which you may have seen the website for, and that one includes sheep as one of its big subspecies that it's looking at, and we are there doing projects on sheep pain, alleviating sheep pain, and recognising pain in sheep, and also similarly looking at the prenatal and neonatal health and welfare of sheep and lambs. So there's lots and lots of research out there, Jude. It's probably far too much to go into in a very short period of time, but lamb survival is one of the points I would probably focus on, because lamb mortality is quite high in many different systems in which we keep sheep, in many different systems across the world. So it's the importance of getting colostrum, the first milk, to lambs. So for them to be able to consume a reasonable amount of colostrum in the first 6 hours after birth, that's extremely important, and is something that we're always emphasising to farmers. And the importance of maintaining the ewe-lamb bond, because sheep are a very highly bonding species with their lambs, and they need to be able to do that to be able to protect their lambs. And those sheep that do form a very strong bond with their lambs and to consume a large amount of colostrum have a better chance of the lamb surviving beyond weaning. So there's, I say, far too much to go into just now, but if you were to look for Kathy Dwyer, who appeared in one of the weeks, I think week 1 or maybe week 2, if you look for her on Google, you will be able to find a lot of research that she's produced on the welfare of sheep, so I hope that helps you.
And I suppose we should also mention that very soon the Animal Welfare Indicators Project will be launching a lamb survival learning object, very much like the interactive sessions that you've been doing. And that will be on the Animal Welfare Hub fairly soon, we hope. We're waiting on the final publication, I believe.
Yes, I think that will be up there by November.
Yeah, so keep an eye on Animal Welfare Hub.
We should tweet that. So I had somebody else ask on the discussion board, why are there no Twitter feeds, or why does the Twitter feed not get updated for the animal welfare indicators? And the general answer is because nobody paid us to be able to spend the time on doing that, which is a terrible answer, I know, but everybody's so busy trying to get the research done and the educational materials produced that they don't spend the time on Twitter. But it's ridiculous, of course, because that's the way you get information out there. So I've passed this on to other people with the Animal Welfare Indicators Project, and hopefully that will get better from now on. So you will see, if you follow Animal Welfare Indicators, you will end up seeing tweets about when our learning materials are out there that you can then use, especially if you are or you know of sheep farmers. They might want to use this particular one on lamb survival. So yes, thanks, Jill. Right then, I'm getting to the next question. Oh yes, so there were quite a few questions on waste milk and milk of cows under medication. So I'm going to answer that one next. So this is from Amritha. So thank you, Amritha, for asking a question. And they say the cows who are under medication, so for example medication for mastitis, would have their milk given to calves, and this is withheld from the food chain. Wouldn't this reach consumers through the calves anyway? Well, that's a great question, and there was a few questions a bit like that on the discussion boards as well. So yes, so there are two ways of feeding calves once they have been removed from the cow, and the huge majority of modern dairy systems, the calf is removed from the cow, and so requires feeding by humans. The first is to use a commercially available milk replacer. This is very commonly used in the UK and the rest of Europe, and is becoming more common in the US and Canada as well. So these have fewer problems, obviously, from the consumer endpoint point of view. The milk replacer is a bit like formula for babies, so it's not necessarily made with all of the stuff that would be in milk, but it does have proteins and things from other sources. When calves are fed milk from cows that are under medication, they will be consuming antibiotics. So they could either be consuming milk that's from a cow before she's been treated, in which case they will be consuming also the pathogens that are involved in mastitis, or they'll be consuming milk that is treated with antibiotics, and they'll get a small antibiotic residue within that milk. Or a mixture of the two, because what lots of farms that use waste milk to feed their calves do is that they pool the milk before then giving it to the calves. So it'll be a dilution of quite a lot of the milk that's been treated with antibiotics. However, you're absolutely right, there is an issue here with the human food chain. So the milk that is treated with antibiotics cannot go into the tank, so it cannot go to the human food chain, and there is a withdrawal period before it enters. But that withdrawal period is only a few days on conventional farms, and about a week and a half for organic farms, depending on what antibiotic is used. So it's not a prolonged period of time, because the milk the antibiotic does get metabolized eventually by the animal anyway and passes through the system. And that is the same for the calves. So the calves will drink the milk, and that will contain antibiotics. But in theory, if you were to then eat that animal, it wouldn't contain the antibiotics anymore, because you wouldn't be eating it directly after it consumed the milk. Most calves that are meat after being on a dairy farm are grown on for beef, so they'll be 2 years old before they are slaughtered. Some calves obviously go for veal production, but they are still 6 to 8 months old and will be on solid feed before they go for slaughter. I know in some countries there is a bobby beef trade and they are milk fed, and I don't know exactly what happens there in making sure that there's no antibiotics, so I won't be able to answer your question for bobby beef. But for both veal and beef that's been produced by dairy calves, they have long since finished drinking the milk, so the antibiotics should have been metabolized a long time ago, so that won't enter the feed chain. However, it's still an interesting question, because if you're giving calves milk from antibiotics one day, and then the next day your cow's finished being treated, so then you're either giving the calves fresh milk, perfectly good for human consumption, or milk replacer, which doesn't have antibiotics in, you have a sawtooth pattern of antibiotics that you're giving to the calf. And that sawtooth pattern, one day which is high, or a couple of days which is high, and then nothing, is the perfect environment in which to grow antibiotic resistance. So I did a bit of research on this a few years ago, and we saw that if you give calves a dose-related sawtooth pattern of milk containing these tiny, tiny amounts of antibiotics, you do see an increase in antibiotic resistance to the same family of bacteria that the antibiotics are, the same family of antibiotics that bacteria would be resistant to. So if it was a penicillin type drug that you've used for the mastitis, it would be a penicillin type resistance that you would see in the bacteria of calf feces. So it seems that whilst the animals are being given the milk, and for a short time afterwards, calves can have antibiotic resistant bacteria within their guts, which is obviously something of an environmental nightmare and possibly a food safety nightmare, as well as potentially affecting how well the cow can be treated for mastitis when that calf has grown up to become a cow, become a milking cow. So it's a really good question, and the answer is we don't really know. So what we haven't done yet is follow those calves through, because you'd have to use an enormous number of cows to get a good cohort, and carry that out blinded would be a very difficult and expensive experiment to carry out. But it would be very interesting to follow the calves right the way through to their adulthood to see if they still have antibiotic resistance bacteria in their guts when they've grown to adulthood. It's something we just don't know. So I think that we would advise farmers not to use milk containing antibiotics to feed their calves. So it's not from a food safety point of view directly, but it could be through this antibiotic resistance. So thank you very much. That's a really good question. I'm glad so many people have managed to join. That's great. There's a couple of people just have written, "Hi, I've just joined," so thank you. Right, maybe we can. Oh, there's a. Oh, I don't want to. There's a question here on organic and conventional farms, and that was another one that was similar to one up on the board as well. So we'll go to that one, and then I'll choose another one from the board that we've had up for the week. So we'll just answer this one, which is from D.A. Erdman. So D.A. has asked, do organic farms and conventional farms have different welfare standards? And if so, how are they different? And how are they similar? So thanks very much. That's another really good question. And the answer is it really depends on where you are in the world when you're looking at your organic and conventionally farmed foods. So the EU has, for example, quite strict regulations on what is and what isn't organic, and also requires there to be a a higher welfare or high welfare component within that. In the US, the organic standards are much more about the feeds that go into the organic animals as opposed to the welfare standards that they're living under. Now, that isn't the case for all organic food within the US. That is the definition of what an organic thing is. So some organic producers in the US will have very high welfare standards, and some will be using organic feed to feed their animals, and that's how they come under organic. So, but it isn't controlled by law as that there must be that high welfare component, if that makes sense. In general, organic farmers, and this big sweeping generalization, but in general, organic farmers take welfare seriously in as much as that they have respect for the animal's natural behavior. But that doesn't necessarily mean, because as we know, what matters from an animal welfare scientist point of view and from the animal welfare point of view is that it's the experience of the animal that counts. So it might be the case that the farmer is very interested in high welfare and natural behavior, but that doesn't necessarily pan out that the animal is experiencing better welfare than on a conventional farm. So there's a couple of things to bear in mind here, and first is drug usage. So animals that are on organic farms in the EU can be treated with antibiotics, but they have longer periods of withdrawal before the product, be it milk or eggs or the animal can be slaughtered. So the withdrawal period is much longer before it can go back into the food train. And there's only a certain number of times that they can be treated with antibiotics and still be considered an organic animal. So in dairy cattle, which I'm sorry to go back to, but they're my species that I look at most, they can be treated 3 times for 3 lots of cases in 1 year. So they might have a treatment where they have 3 tubes of antibiotics for mastitis. So these tubes are the things that you stick into the udder, which have the antibiotics. And you can there's 3 of them, and that's 1 use. So you can 3 tubes, 1 use, and then that can be done 3 times over a year, and that animal still be classified as organic. In the States, this is not the case. So animals that are treated with antibiotics become conventional or non-organic straight away. What we find with some of the organic farms in the States is that they also have a conventional farm right next door, so that any animals that do need to be treated with antibiotics or have a severe case of something that needs to be treated with drugs, they get moved on to the conventional farm and aren't kept on the organic farm anymore. The problem with the antibiotic use or not is that some farmers are extremely against using antibiotics and other types of drugs that are of a similar sort of vein. They are much more interested in using alternative treatments. And some alternative treatments are effective, and there is evidence for that, and some of them there is no evidence that they are effective. Now, you may decide that you would particularly like to use homeopathy or other types of alternatives on yourself, which is absolutely up to you. But if you want to have a farm with 100 cows on it and you're using homeopathy on those cows, I would prefer it that if they're having a painful condition like mastitis, that you knew that it was effective. And as yet, we have no firm evidence that homeopathy or many of the other alternatives are effective in treating the animal for either the symptoms, the condition itself, or the pain associated with the condition. So that's one of the problems. And then the other problem with organics is that they have to be fed organic feed. Now that sounds stupid. Why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem if you're still using these high producing animals. So again, if we think about dairy cattle, if you've got the high producing Holsteins and you put this high producing Holstein cow into an organic environment and you're feeding it organically derived foods, you have to feed it a higher proportion of forage than the conventional farm cows have to get, they get a lot less energy in that feed. Because they get a lot less energy in the feed, there is some evidence that they feel hungry. So organic cows might feel more hungry than conventionally farmed cows, and that they are more aggressive at feeding because they have that hunger there. And there's some evidence that they also get more subclinical metabolic problems, such as ketosis. And that's probably because of that differential between their genetics, which is for super high yielding, and their feed, which is for organics. So again, we would recommend that you choose your breed for your system. So if you're going to have an organic system, that if you want Holsteins, to go for lower producing ones, or to try and find a more robust breed that you can have feeding on organic feeds that doesn't have that super high milk yield genetics. So organic try to have higher welfare, want to have this more of a natural environment and respect the animals very much, but there are these problems with trying to use very, very high yielding animals in these types of environments. So I hope that's answered your question there, DA, and I know there's quite a few questions on this on the boards as well. So I'm going to try and answer a question from the board now, and then hopefully we'll have one more from this list as well. Right then. Yes.
Might be a good round up for.
Yes, I might leave that one till last. Yeah. Sorry, we're looking at the list here. Now then, there was one on, oh yes, beef welfare. So Jacko, or Yako, I'm not sure how you pronounce your name, I'm afraid, asked what's the possibility of focusing on beef livestock more as an item of importance. So people have asked for sheep and goats and now beef. So we are sorry about that, because there was only so much we could do in this 1 week little chunk of time here to try and cover as much as possible as an introduction to farm animal welfare. So we chose 3 of these species, or 3 of the systems, there's actually 4 because we had layers and broilers, that are used worldwide. And that the systems are increasing rather than decreasing. So pigs and poultry particularly are really, really increasing in the world. There's an awful lot more of pigs and poultry being eaten, and the production systems are getting more intensive rather than less in many places in the world. And dairy cattle too, they might actually be decreasing in Europe, but they're very much increasing in Asia. So that's why we went for those species. So worldwide we can see global increases in those particular types of systems. But beef cattle, yes, they do have a lot of interesting areas to discuss in terms of welfare, so it would be great to do that, but it would be very difficult to do that within this 1 week's time. What I would suggest is there's quite a lot of research out there on beef cattle just now. There's a lot of research in Canada from Saskatchewan, so if you were to look at that, there's a lot of work on weaning in beef cattle from there. There's we've done work here on handling of beef cattle, and obviously Temple Grandin, if there's the link to Temple Grandin's website on the Coursera page, and she's done an awful lot in both cattle handling and systems for ranches, and also slaughter as well. But this particular person, Jacko, has asked, there are lots of similarities with intensive dairy farming methods, yep, absolutely, and which the beef farms in drier areas are moving to by using irrigated pastures, especially by centre pivots that can handle large areas of pastures. The welfare of the livestock in rural Africa is a serious topic. Absolutely, and this is something that I say it's difficult to cover in a short period of time, but would be something that we'd be very interested in looking at in further detail. So there are other places where you can find that information from, and I wish you the best of luck in that. But we don't want to belittle the subject of beef welfare, but unfortunately we're not able to cover it in any detail. The welfare of livestock in rural Africa is quite an interesting one in itself. We have some links with the group in Namibia who are have very successfully increased the health of their cattle livestock, which is something that's very interesting, by using very efficient culling systems. So they've been culling out animals that aren't producing well, but they've also been able to fence off large amounts of areas to enable to have higher health systems, so to keep diseases from other areas out. But there are, of course, problems then with wildlife-livestock interactions, and that's another thing that we couldn't really go into in any great detail, but is something though there's an awful lot of research going. Anyway, it was a really interesting question, Jaco, but I'm afraid we're not able to go to it in any detail just now. But please watch this space. We may tweak things for another go of the Coursera course. Right then, I'm going to try and do one more from here on this list here, and then we'll come back to this one at the end, Lorraine, and we'll go from there. So, oh, I need the mouse back. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll try and find this one as well.
Most of these actually just say, "We can hear you, we can see you." Oh dear. Okay, so there is one here on, we'll have a go with this, shall we? This is from Rupert, who asks, "Hi there, so my question is, due to the fact that most, if not all, non-human animals cannot comprehend the future, is there anything wrong with painlessly slaughtering bull calves at birth?" Ooh, that's a bit of a question. So there's quite a few things within that question, aren't there? There's, first of all, there's painlessly slaughtering bull calves at birth. So there's the can you do that humanely, and how would you do that? Now, I'm not going to go through the whole aspect of welfare at slaughter, but we believe you can minimise pain at slaughter by carrying out humane slaughter methods. So we could say then that the death of the animal is not in itself a welfare issue if we can carry that out painlessly. And so what you're asking there is that those animals can't really comprehend their future, that they don't have knowledge that they could have a future life. So if you were to destroy the animal at birth, is there a problem with that? Well, often my problem with it is that the bull calves don't get destroyed at birth. They don't get shot or with a captive bolt at birth. It happens a few days later. And so what my feeling is that the animal should have the highest welfare it can do while it's alive. So again, it's this quantity versus quality and quality of life argument. What I absolutely don't want to see, and I know why it happens, is because farmers don't like shooting their stock, which is understandable, but they may have a calf that is left for a while before somebody else can come in and shoot it and take away the carcass. What I have seen occasionally then is that that calf doesn't get fed or doesn't get fed very much, so it might get the first drink of colostrum and then nothing else. And that is where my main problem with that is. So if the farmer is to shoot it at birth, my opinion is that if it can be done humanely, that it isn't a welfare problem. I would prefer it if the cow wasn't there to see that, so after the cow has been removed. But that it isn't necessarily a welfare problem itself. But of course, there's this big question, if you can comprehend the future. So there's a big ethical discussion, actually, of whether killing a healthy animal is taking away its positive future, and whether that can be counted as a negative thing from an ethical point of view. So I think it is more of an ethical question than a welfare one per se, but there is that sort of big question of you are taking an animal before its prime, as it were, or in its prime, if you're thinking about beef animals in general, and is that therefore a problem? It's a very, very good ethical question, and it's something that we could talk about for a very long time, I think. I'm just watching the rain coming down here, my goodness. It's probably in the background. It's very, very heavy rain. But it's a very good ethical question. It's not one that we could maybe go into hugely just now, but it's something that it would be very good to discuss on the boards, I think.
Yeah, I would just like to chime in and say that the role of science in this question is to determine how methods can be painless slaughter, and to what extent does the animal suffer during its life. And the ethical question in here is, should we be slaughtering animals at all? I mean, it's, as we have said throughout this course, we are there to protect the welfare of the animals which are being used in the system currently, regardless of the ethical question, should we use animals? So it's all tied into one, and it's great that people discuss it on the forums. And I think you've been very good at doing it in a respectful fashion. So yeah, good on you guys. Keep doing it.
Well, the other thing I suppose about this one is that science can also come in by reducing the number of bull calves born. So there is such a thing as sexed semen, which is a great conversation to have in the pub with your non-sciencey friends. But yes, you can sex semen, so you can pick out the sperm which is going to produce female calves. And that is something that is available now, and farmers can use it. Now, there are some problems with it. Firstly, it's very expensive. Secondly, it has a slightly lower fertility rate than normal semen, and then some farmers don't like to use it on all of their cows. They might only use it on their special cows, which are their super high yielding cows or whatever. So there is some resistance to using it, but it is out there and it could be used, and that could dramatically reduce the number of bull calves that are born and the number of bull calves that need to be wasted in such a way. So I hope that answers your question a little bit, if not been able to go into the ethics behind it too much there. But absolutely, we don't think that animals really understand the future, though we do think that quite a lot of animals have a concept of time. So I suspect that there's more science that could be done there on whether animals really do have a concept of future or not. But at present, the best evidence is that they don't, not beyond the very near future. And there, from a welfare point of view, we feel that humane slaughtering means that there isn't a welfare problem as long as the life of the animal has been looked after. Can I grab my mouse back, Lorraine?
And Fritha, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that many studies done on animals which are thought to think of the future, such as squirrels burying nut, are actually shown to be much more instinctive and based on what we call in behavioural ecology social eavesdropping, where they watch other animals and remember what's happened rather than actually predicting what the future may bring. So that's a very complicated scientific topic, and possibly even a whole MOOC in itself.
No, absolutely. So we know that that some animals can think into a short while into the future, but we as yet have no evidence for that long-term thinking of into the future. So absolutely, there's lots of research out there though, and if that's what you want to go in to have a look at, please feel free. There's an awful lot out there. We are coming up to the end. We were a wee bit late starting. There's loads more questions coming outside. So, oh gosh, there's lots of questions coming here now as well. My goodness.
I can't find the reference to that other one. I've been having a little look. I might just not be picking up the topic correctly. I'm really not an expert in animal welfare and such.
But you are helping wonderfully in helping me run this effectively, so thanks very much. Right, well, quickly, we'll maybe address this one, and then we'll come back to a comment on the boards. So this one is from Alexandra, and she says, in the course lecture, it was said that letting animals walk freely outside can spread disease. Are the diseases not spread in closed territory? Well, that's again a very good question, and this I think specifically relates to what we were saying in the lecture about laying hens, looking at free-range systems. So animals that are kept in the cages are kept away from their droppings. So if you're in a bog standard battery cage, a barren, as the proper term is, barren battery cage, or a furnished cage like we showed you in the videos. Barren battery cages, by the way, are banned in the EU, but are used elsewhere in the States, in Canada, in Asia particularly, and also in South America. So if you're in a cage, you're separated from your droppings. So there is much lower possibility of disease transfer from fecal contamination. Whereas when they are in birds are in a housed environment, that is a aviary or a perchery system or a barn system, they do have possibility of getting one another's droppings, and so there is disease possibilities there. When hens particularly are free range, they go out onto the range, they are in contact then with not only droppings from their fellow hens within the shed, but also with wild birds, and wild birds can bring in a lot of diseases that are also catchable by hens. Yes, when you have animals in close proximity, if they have a disease, then all the other animals are likely to get it. But the point of the cage systems is that they try and, oh, we've got thunder now, they try and minimize disease completely, so that the animals they don't have any disease or not very much, and therefore the probabilities of everybody getting a disease is very low. So they have extremely high health systems. Myself and the video man, when we went to the farm with the furnished cages, had to sit an hour and a half's health and safety lecture, had to be passed as biosecure, had to fill in a test before we could go anywhere near those hens. And that isn't the case for free-range systems. It is the case for actually going on the farm, but of course the birds that are flying over don't know that, and they can on the range. So that's why free-range systems have a slightly higher disease problem than caged birds. So caged birds have a very low mortality. Of course, they have lots of other welfare challenges, but they do have a very low mortality rate. In other animals, such as pigs, there are fewer diseases that pigs would pick up from flying birds going over, but pigs can pick up quite a few human diseases, and there's crossover as well with some other mammals. So again, most breeding facilities where the pigs are worth a lot of money have extremely high biosecurity. And as if you know anything about recent problems in the UK, we also have cattle and wildlife, possibilities of cattle-wildlife transfer of disease with TB. There's an awful lot of controversy there as well. But basically, if you're putting your animals outside, there's a possibility they're going to interact with other things which can give them diseases. If you keep them all together, yes, they're going to pass diseases from one another, but they might not catch them in the first place, and therefore there might not be a problem of disease. Hopefully that makes sense. Right then, I'm going to come back. Did you manage to find it? No.
I might just be not seeing it.
It's quite all right. There's lots and lots of questions there. So one of our questions from Anonymous on boards has was commenting about the complexity of the subject of animal welfare and the issues with people's opinions and scientific evidence, and how knowing about how, I suppose, animals are produced and what you are eating and what other people are eating if you're not consuming it, is the key to be able to influence attitude. So thanks very much for that, Anonymous. I think this is probably a very good way to wrap up this week that we've had here discussing farm animal welfare. But a lot of people never go anywhere near farms, and quite a lot of farms, as I've just mentioned there with furnished cages, you're never going to be able to see. So it's very difficult to be able to have that knowledge about how our animals are produced. When you talk to people who are, people on the streets, as they're known, about dairy cattle, for example, most people do not realise that dairy calves are not kept with their mothers. And this is something that they don't know, and then they're shocked to find out, and that then can make them think about things. So absolutely, first of all, the knowledge of how animals are kept is very important to influence the attitudes of people. But furthermore than that, it's not just the knowledge of how animals are produced, but understanding the scientific basis for animal welfare means that whatever knowledge you gain from carrying out that science is less refutable than opinion, we think. And therefore, if you go to governments with, here is the information about why a farrowing crate is stressful, here we can show that where stress occurs during the farrowing crate, where other problems occur, so problems with piglet savaging and that sort of thing in farrowing crates occur, then you've got more of a basis to be able to say, and here we've done research with an alternative, and this is a possibility that can be brought in. And perhaps then that's when policymakers and governments will listen and make changes. Unfortunately, those changes can take an awful lot of time, so it's great to be able to influence consumers as well as governments, because consumers have more power more quickly to make changes. They don't have a lot of power in the choice, but they certainly can make small changes that can make quite big differences in animals' lives. And I think that's probably about as far as we can go today, as it's 3:10, and we've taken up probably quite a lot of your time already. So thanks very much for those people who've been able to put questions on the boards. I'm sorry I wasn't able to answer all of them. What we'll do is we'll go back onto the boards over the next few days and after the weekend to try and answer some of those questions that we didn't answer in the Google Hangouts. And thanks ever so much for everybody who's able to join us today, and thank you for your questions as well. I feel like I've spoken an awful lot, and I need to stop that now and maybe go and get a drink of water. I hope you are finished having a great time with the Animal Behaviour and Welfare course. Next week we're going to be looking at captive wildlife, so particularly zoos and aquaria. So I hope you are able to join us for that, and join Heather next week for the Google Hangout on captive wildlife. Thanks ever so much for being here, and bye for now.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for Jill as well for being there as well.
Yeah,
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Stop people. So that's those questions. Now then, where's the other one? Somebody asked a great question about pain. I'm just going to scroll to it, so hang on 1 second. Where is it now? Here we go. Pain identification and management. So the question was from Anonymous, and they asked about phantom pain. So they said humans with amputations are known to suffer phantom pain from the missing and amputated limb. Presumably they take pain meds or do some kind of mind exercise to deal with this. And he or she, Anonymous here, wondered if animals with docked tails and trimmed beaks, etc., feel phantom pain, and if so, how do we know? Well, that's a fantastic question, Anonymous, and the answer is we do have some evidence that animals that have some kind of amputation feel phantom pain. So this is generally formed in humans if neuromas, which are sort of nerve scar tissue, if they are formed when the limb is amputated. And we know that the hot blade method for laying hen beak trimming can form neuromas in the beak. The beak, of course, is a very, very sensitive area and is used by the hen to explore the environment as well as to eat food. And so it's very in the animals that are being eaten by us and the animals that are on the farm together and possibly eating other animals as well. So fantastic, but probably not Also, because these are laying hens, we don't actually eat them, we only eat their eggs, so I don't know whether there's any evidence of prions being transferred to eggs. We had lots of questions about milking cows, looking into the video cameras when we went and did our videoing there. And both the cows and the pigs were very curious when we came round with our cameras. And dairy cows in general are very, very curious animals. They tend to spend a lot of time with humans. Obviously, they're very well handled. They are handled on a daily basis. So they're not afraid of humans in the same way that maybe sheep would be when they're not used to human handling. So bringing along a tripod and a big camera and a couple of extra people meant that the cows were very curious about what was going on. If you watch the bits where we took videos in the parlour, you'll also know the cows were looking at us from when they were in the parlour and not walking out as what they were supposed to be doing. Yeah, absolutely, they're very interested in novel things. Our pigs are also very interested in novel things as well, and were looking at the camera and interacting with us. And we tend to find that pigs that are very well handled and have a good stock person are more friendly and also less scared of novel objects such as video cameras than those that have a poor relationship with evaded. And removing that end of the beak means that it's possible to form neuromas, and say the hot blade method tends to do that more than the infrared method, which is one of the reasons why the infrared method is preferred in the EU. The neuromas are what we think are the mechanism for the phantom pain that people feel when they have limbs amputated. This is also reported in the stump of pigs' tails as well after tail docking, so it's likely that pigs will also be able to feel the phantom pain, or feel that they can still feel the end of the stump of their tail once it's removed. So ideally we would want to minimise these types of mutilations as much as possible. It's not always possible, as you know, so some mutilations such as ear tagging are very important for the identification of animals. But tail docking is only really done, tail docking in pigs that is only really done because of poor environments. If you increase the amount of enrichment that's in an environment and you have space for animals to move away from aggressive or bullying animals, then you don't, as a rule, need to dock tails. So ideally farmers would move away from very barren environments and use more enriched environments, and then they wouldn't need to dock the tails, and therefore reduce the factor of the phantom tail pain, as it were. It's a little bit more tricky with the beak trimming, because that's something that's done green over there, so I'm going to occasionally look over there to read them, but hopefully I'll remember to come back over here and answer the questions looking into the camera. But as I say, I can't see me, so hopefully you can. Right then. I'm just wondering if I can do anything about the camera thing here. It went off as soon as I pressed start, didn't it? But never mind. We'll just continue on, either as a disembodied voice, or hopefully you can see me too. My camera appears to be working, but as I say, I can't see it. Never mind. Well, the first question that somebody was asking, Suzanne was asking on the discussion board, was about cannibalism in poultry. So we looked in the laying hen video about feather pecking, which is very, very common, and cannibalism, which is less so, but still quite a common occurrence and a common cause of death in laying hens. Now Suzanne asks, given that cannibalism occurs in poultry, is there any evidence of prion disease occurring or possibly developing as a result? And the answer is, so far, no. Bearing in mind that most of the cannibalized birds are caught fairly quickly, so they're not eaten to a great extent, and also they tend to be eaten from the back end up rather than the top, so there wouldn't be very much central nervous system tissue digested by the birds that are doing the cannibalizing. that it's fairly unlikely. But it was a great question because it shows that we're thinking about links between Well, hello and welcome everybody. I hope you can see me. My name is Dr. Fritha Langford and I'm today going to hopefully answer some of your questions here on the Google Hangout. I have with me in the room Lorraine here, who is our Jean Marchignes Centre Administrator, and she's helping me out because I am here all on my own today. And we do have Jill Mackay lurking in the background, but online from somewhere else, so you may hear from her as well at some point. Now, I can't see me, so I hope you can see me because, unfortunately, my video seems to have gone, but never mind. What we'll do to start with is answer some of the questions that have been up in the discussion board over the week, and then if we get live questions in thereafter, then we can answer those as well. So let's make a start. Well, I'd like to thank everybody, first of all, for all the great questions that have been on the discussion boards so far. They've been really interesting. I particularly enjoyed the questions about cow and calf separation because that's something that I'm very interested in. And we've also had a lot of discussion about the basics, I suppose, on why are male laying hens killed, destroyed at birth, and why do we not eat them, and all of those sort of things. So those have been really, really very interesting from our point of view, and I hope you found them useful as well. Right then, without further ado, I'm going to start with some of these questions that have been on the link that we've had up for the week. If I just get the right bit right. So I apologise that the questions are on this